Yes, that's what I'm going to talk about today. But as there was no abstract on the conference page, you won't know the original intention. So I will also mention that originally we were supposed to come here with a group of group involving more people from the design side, including our design team, architect, interaction designer, filmmaker, and so on. But as I'm giving this talk, I'm taking the advantage of bringing it more back to the museum side. And my background is in museum research and communication, and I'm also part of this curators team working with this project. So there were different ways to approach to this topic, but this is now just my angle to that. We're working with an exhibition. First stage will be opened in half a year, next spring, with a preliminary title, Secret City. And firstly, I will tell you about what it is, what the topic is about. The topic, the wider framework is approaching the city, the urban environment, and this everyday life level and aspect, and everyday practices, how people use the space and how they experience the city. There are talks about how people create the city and city creates people and the urban space respectively. So how public urban space acquires meaning and what kind of functions there are for people, what kind of practices they are having. But as you can see, we narrowed it down. We got a little bit more playful, and actually we are working with the topic of how children and urban youth experience and use this public urban space. I have to mention also that in Estonia we are not talking about huge mega cities, so we are talking about small towns really, but I think it is still relevant. So what we have done, it is a research-based exhibition. We're literally also working with kids, especially my colleague, the main curator, Ihti, who is not here. We're working with kids, mapping, using different research techniques and experimental methods to get this data, because there is no much research from this perspective as this is a cultural experience. Mostly, if you get the topic of children and the city, you end up with very relevant and useful, but not topical for us. Let's say the good city, how to bring children knowledge into city planning, creating better urban spaces and so on. So we left that aside, although the more I read about it, the more fascinating it becomes. But our framework is ethnological, anthropological. We tracked for kids how they describe the city, how they experience it, what kind of categories they use. So we identified fear and play and darkness and noise and these different kind of sensory categories, but also values and psychological reaction. So here in the background is just one drawing from how we started to by visual mapping to track these topics, and what kind of urban domestication tactics they implement. So very central to this layer became urban space as a playground, as different hiding spaces. So how kids actually privatize the town, the public space, how they kind of find bubbles. Whereas with urban youth, we are working on the level of media cities, media, urban environment as a social network and so on. So very complicated ideas, and even more complicated. What is fascinating, or what is the trigger for the researchers in this project, is that like thinking about playground maybe as a metaphor to any kind of contemporary social phenomenon, like these words from cultural theory, transformations, revolutions, normalization, these processes. Of course, we can't bring them to the exhibition, but it is this conceptual background of research. And there is also some need, especially in this youth studies, the need to move around from debates, but also descriptions about youth cultures, looking them, for example, as subcultures or these kinds of entities, that to go approach them as situated practices, and so this exhibition a little bit tries to localize it in urban settings. But now this was the research part. I could give a different presentation about that, but we have to move about what is going on, why we are talking about it as a design challenge, perhaps. And now I have to explain. There are lots of things I put together here quickly. The whole project is situated in a big process Estonian National Museum is currently facing. We are moving from one old small building to 2016 into a brand new museum building in the same town, but a big one, which means reinventing the whole house and producing permanent exhibitions. So what we are doing now, this exhibition is actually part of part of exhibition lab. So it links to the presentation about working in beta. So that is it. It is the third exhibition, and earlier we have my colleagues have worked with language exhibition about language. So we did an exhibition about consumer culture, and now the urban topic. And here is. In a way, briefly, I will not go into it, but what we expect from this exhibition lab, why we don't just plan this exhibition space over here and that's it, why they struggle. But actually, working in beta enables us to approach different angles, to work with, to develop ourselves, but to question also our abilities and skills in both this developing technical solutions, thinking about design aspects and collaboration in it, experiment with these traditional showcases and part of what is the mechanic of exhibitions, and also bring in this new museology, which was not so much present in our previous, the way we did exhibitions before. So we are trying to bring everything together, mix it up, and it becomes really, really complicated. And now suddenly a secret city where it becomes even more complicated, because we started to work with an exhibition lab, which was a space, public open exhibition space in the old house. But as it is not working very well, so the proposal came from the designer team to use also other opportunities. Perhaps as we are working with urban, why not also involve a street? This is actually a street which is heading towards the new future building of the museum. And whereas the other talks here I have heard really have talked about exhibitions in some measurable ways as products. Someone put it nicely that we're talking about them as products. So suddenly we are talking about making an exhibition as a dynamic process through everything, starting with this exhibition launched next year, and then in a way symbolically moving towards the new house, where this content and exhibition design actually merges into the big, so to say, permanent exhibition. They still exist to some extent, right? So it will become part, it will transform and become part of something else. And now I actually reached to the maybe main challenges of doing it all. We mixed it up, so we have to face it, and actually bringing together different disciplinary backgrounds and trying to frame this process, not to finishing the exhibition just there and opening it and giving it to the hand of, let's say, museum educators. Actually, we really are even now facing this, what I as a researcher call discursive confusion, and there are just examples of that. So if I showed you these different spaces, we could just simply approach it as a task for designers and curators as preparing some kind of traveling exhibition. This has been done, and this is still done, and this is useful if you have one message, you take it to different contexts, schools, shopping malls. It is widely practiced. So everything could be based on a strategy of designing visitor experiences for traveling exhibition, which is not just on the walls, and to make it a little bit more. So this is one approach. This is exhibition design approach. Then we had a discussion about what is left, or what can a design do if we're talking about this process where especially this moving part outlines the issue that it is actually exhibition is about designing long cycles and short cycles. Long cycle might be working throughout these 3 years and changing the exhibition respectively. Whereas the other part definitely is what we are talking here most about. It's this short cycle where we are talking about person interacting with the exhibition maybe in 5-minute time frame. Like what kind of design tools can come in for this long cycle and what can come in for this short time frame. So the proposal, one of the proposal from the designer's part is that maybe the interaction designer mostly comes forward as part of this short cycle, whereas maybe an architect works on this long cycle. There is a lot of things we might discuss how it really works. So this is one possible strategy. So for the exhibition, we have this analog layers, digital layers, and so on. And what is common is actually that if you're taking your content into different places, then the user experience or visitor experience is the same. In cross-media discussion, it's generally acknowledged that you have a user or consumer for one platform and for the other, and maybe the content they see is different from the other user's experience. Like the user or consumer experience is not continuous across those platforms. This can be very well be street, exhibition space, another exhibition space. Another way to borrow the design strategy from media studies or discussions is strategy of transmedia storytelling, which is different in a way that you take cross-media, the transmedia aspect of it, and distribute your story across all platforms, so they all speak together. This is what initially we might wish, but which becomes also very complicated. And then finally, strategy for a distributed museum. Of course, it's important to say that I think also in this room, the distributed museum concept would be defined in different ways. It's conceptualized very much, for example, in this learning networks. But I think that how I understand it is the story about museum becoming a kind of node in a multitude of spaces, experiences, environments, users, learners, audiences, so networks of people. So here is where I finally actually arrive my destination point, that all these strategies might be very good, but what is actually on the ground level is people, museum connecting, providing meaningful ways to understand content and for the audiences or people. And here, when we reach people, we have huge amount of different segmentation approaches, marketing approaches, approaches describing people's relations to the museum from functional perspectives. Here, maybe some of you will notice some phrases come from Falk, who distributed or who he has in a way this market page approach, but tries to connect the story with visitors' identities. So describing museum visitors. we have different groups, target groups for marketing research. So how to make sense, this is not anything, this is not the starting point for any kind of design strategy. It is too messy. So, and of course I don't have the end answer here, but where I'm reaching, or where I'm getting with this this presentation here, is actually this triangle here, and this could be described as strategy based on audience engagement. There are different ways to read it. Here today there is no time to talk about this, how it's formed, these roles and the relations with the museum are formed by people themselves, their identities. There have been talks about people coming with their own values, meanings and so on to the museum. So these kinds of relations, big part is the user or visitor side of the people. But actually there is also, if we take this model into consideration, there is something design can add to facilitate or kill these relationships. It's crucial. So the model doesn't describe a single person's way to the participant. Quite often museum participation is taken to this ideal model and say that what can we do to move people from one layer to the other, from one level to another. Actually, it's important to realize that this, they are presented here hierarchically, like there is more engagement and there is less engagement. But this is highly situational and contextual and event-based. So one person can build these different relations or can move from participant to public. Public here is potentially, we have to take into consideration that museum is not part of networks, but it is part practically of any cultural or social space. So public is basically everyone out there. They might change their role slightly or not. Audiences are already people who have some connection to the museum. They have at least heard about it, maybe even from the friend. Maybe the knowledge from the museum is part of everyday conversations. But they have some kind of offline or online connection, so we certainly can consider that there is this design and production aspect in it here already. Visitors are most often talked about, but visitor as a concept is highly tricky, because as soon as we start talking about visitors, we think about this immediate experience of entering the museum door or entering the museum virtually. So we lose a lot if we limit discussions here. User participants. I think that this our urban youth children and urban youth project actually the basic model or the ground where to continue. It is about not primarily about these spaces or moving tactics or platforms. It's actually what creates the continuity and either makes this process work or not is how design can help or can take into consideration these different engagements to design them as dynamic processes, to take into consideration that people switch from one mode to another, and these are present in every level. I'm glad I can here bring the example not from our exhibition, but actually from presentation by Samir. I think what he did is in the framework of this model is that taking something out on the street, which this can end up giving your work in the hands of public, the passers-by, the ones who are not connected. So if you don't get it right, this is what happens. It will be your content, and it will be, and you will rely just on their identities or capacity to change. But if you get it right, as Samir did, then immediately you switch those. It is not gradual climbing up or back and forth. It is you just switch those. Those who were passers-by suddenly become involved, engaged, motivated. They become participants. So there is immense social value with it, which could just be described as kind of marketing strategy. So I don't have the next slide where I would put the answer, the design answer to it. So perhaps we will come back in 2 years and tell you how it happened. But instead of my message is perhaps that instead of different strategies targeting just one part of this design, this big exhibition process enables to see that maybe you have to step back from your immediate task and go to this big model, museum communication model. Museums are all about communication. So that's it. Here is also the working group with no pictures, and I would like to thank them all, and that's what I had to say today.